And finally, post-secondary success. We're combining graduation rate, post-secondary success. And if there's one piece of data that I drive our staff crazy with right now, is I'm just like enamored by looking at this data and what it's telling us or not telling us. And I drive Brad crazy with it.
Only on weekends.
Yeah, only on weekends. So it's high school graduates that enroll. It's 2 and 4 year. Here's the sheet that I want you to look at, which is this side right here. I want to tell you the limitations of the National Student Clearinghouse data, because there are limitations. Number one, does not include military. And I thought changing K-12 was hard. I thought it was hard as a superintendent and as a principal. I think it's hard at a state level. I think Blake Flanders, it's really hard to change higher ed, right? Because it's got all these people. You want to think you can change the military? Oh my gosh. We're like on step 38 trying to make our way to the Pentagon, I think, to see if they'll release to us this data that they say is privacy. So it does not include those that enlist in the military. It does include those of your kids that go on to one of the academies. So if they go on to West Point or Annapolis, it does include. But they enlist in the Marines, no. Statewide, it's a little bit over 1%. But I'm going to guess, we don't know this, I'm going to guess if you're in Gary County or you're in Leavenworth County, it may be higher because you're around a fort. I'm guessing that. So we'd love to get that data. We don't have it. So I don't know. James, you're tracking every kid. Do you know what yours is? Okay. So that would be my guess too, just guessing. But if you want to just add 1% to this statewide data, you're probably going to get it. Some schools are not in this data. We have been using K-Board data, which it's kind of like grades, right? If you have multiple teachers teaching the same class and everyone thinks they understand what an A, B, C is, and you know it has no real meaning. Well, the K-Board data was horrible, but we were all using it. So it tracks in and out of state, 2 and 4 year, certificate, associate, baccalaureate, master's, PhDs, advanced degrees. However, let me tell you 2 glaring omissions right now. Well, I shouldn't say that right now. When we ran this, Baker University, not in here. So you're sitting in Baldwin, you're probably worried about that. Flint Hills Technical College, not in here. So I know Kevin Case and Emporia keeps beating me up on that. However, they all gave assurance that by April 1, that's why I said when we ran this, they would be in the system. Because if they're not in the pool, then we know our data is not as accurate as it can be. This is about 97 to 98% accurate across the nation. That doesn't mean if I go to the Louisiana Bayou Theology School that it may not be in there. I get it, okay? I'm just telling you all the faults and the good. We think it's about as good as we can get. If you're small, you can track this yourself. If you're big, it's harder, you know? So take it for what it is. We have some limitations, but we think it's pretty good. And we're giving you this data by the end of April. Every school in the state, whether you've been getting it now or not, you're going to get it by the end of April. We've been playing with it in a lot of ways. But here's the deal. When we give it to you, Kansas City Star will also have it. So that's why we haven't given it to you yet. I say we're not going to call them up, but they call us, or KPI. We like to get that data. Well, we have to release it, and then they can start doing whatever they do to it. So we're going to walk you through today how to look at it. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
We're getting ready.
Can you hold on just a second? We're going to walk through it, but thank you. So when you get it in April, you're going to see batch of the class of 2010. All we're doing right now is looking in the rearview mirror. We haven't looked forward. We're just looking to see what happened before. And we're going to be looking at 5 years of data, and I'll tell you why in a second. So let's look at this. This is the class of 2000, and 10. State averages. Okay, state averages. So you mark on this. Make notes. Stop and ask questions as we go through that's not clarified. Okay?
As we go through this, keep this in mind. Let's say you had 100 kids graduate in 2010. So this is when that 100 kids, 10, 11 were freshmen in college. This is the same 100 kids all the way through of just your graduates. Not if they didn't graduate, just the ones that got a high school diploma, and the kid can change colors. But it's following those same 100 all the way through.
Okay? So mark on this. Here we go. We're looking at the class of 2010, as Brad said. This, in a second, we're going to look at a 5-year. Just right now, for our illustrated purposes, you're going to get this for 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, 16, soon to be the class of 17. And then we'll keep it up to date with, as we go forward. We're looking at that 6-year period. The clearinghouse only tracks kids 6 years out of high school, then it lets them go. So we don't know after 6 years out of high school what happened. But we do know up to 6 years. Pretty good. Remember when we used to run the survey data? Shall you have a question?
No.
Okay. When we used to run the survey data, how inaccurate, we got like 30% of them back. All right, so let's start here. Green area represents those that went on to school, just under 65%. They went to a technical school, a community college, 4-year university, not the military, add a percent to it. Now, remember, we're trying to hit 70 and 75% because that's what Georgetown says our job market is in Kansas. Well, to get to 70 to 75% and we start with 65, we got to do some work. If all these kids graduated, we're not there. That's why we have this. When you go out and talk to your employers, they say, I have these jobs I can't fill because they don't have kids that are credentialed enough to get them. All right, so follow along. I'm going to take you then to the very end. What happens to them 6 years later? And then we'll backward map. 6 years after they graduated high school, this chart right here,
Same 100 kids.
39.6% of them completed anything. Let's call it 40. They have a certificate, they have an associate degree, they have a baccalaureate. Now, let's say Peabody Burns, kid graduates here and gets a certificate. Then here they got an associate degree. Then here they got a baccalaureate. And here they got a master's, right? You'll have some of that. You're only counted once. This number is only counted once. Whatever they got first. Now when you get the data, you can see that kid all the way through, but they're only counted once. Whenever they had a certificate, an associate, a baccalaureate, you have a master's or PhD, you're not counted twice.
So this, you can't hardly see it, it's 0.6. That means this year you had another 4%. So it accumulates. It doesn't keep adding. So this kid probably got an associate's right out of high school.
Or a credential.
And we consider that a success. So it just accumulates, doesn't keep adding the numbers together.
So when you look at your own data, if you're doing okay sending kids, we're going to call this okay, you're going to see most likely a 20 to 25% drop 6 years out. Now, I say most likely. When we look at some schools that are not sending many kids here, their numbers actually kind of rise. But you go look at Andover. Well, they're going to start a little higher, but they drop off 25%. Does that make sense? Most of you are going to see this drop off. So the question becomes, what happens to them over that 6 years? And that's these two areas right here. So when you get this data at home, look at your purple and your yellow lines. Because if your purple are significantly greater than your yellow, you have a culture of not going to post-secondary school. Highest poverty areas are going to see that. That make sense? Statewide, it's about a little bit, not quite, but about 50-50 split. If you are seeing most of the yellow, this is pretty small, but you're having a dropout, they don't complete, then that's a different question. Your higher social economic tend to have this higher than this. That's a different question as you think about when you go to the R's of what you're going to try to scale. So I know, Mike, you guys have looked at this in viewer. I'm going to guess, and I haven't studied it, that your yellow may be higher than your purple. That sound right? Probably is. You know, if I look at, for example, the Kansas City Diocese, well, their purple's pretty small. They send almost every kid. But boy, their yellow's big. And their yellow is big in years 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. Now, Blake Flanders says if this yellow is big, that's the kiss of death. Because what it means is, what do I have to show? I have a high school education and I have debt. These kids just have a high school education and no debt. So that's how you read those two. Now, here's the problem. How long do we have to keep track of this, and how long do we own these kids? So we worked with KBOR in the private schools, and we've said this. Don't you like that? I love this slide. We just got rid of the last 4 years. Isn't that cool? Okay? This is our part. That's KBOR's part. This is our part. That's KBOR's part. This is our part. Okay? So, have you heard this? You heard this? You guys quit sending all of us these kids that need remedial education. Do you know that if you go to Cali County, use Hutch, we're here in Hutch, go to Hutch Community College, or if you go to Bethel College, or if you go to Fort Hays State, they calculate who goes into remedial differently. Did you know that? They have different scores on who goes into remedial. So you can't use that data because it's not apples to apples. So we've just decided not to. We've decided to use the 2-year, what happens 2 years out of high school, to calculate, to take that in consideration. So 2 years out of high school, in the class of 2010, 49.7 started here and are retained, meaning they came back for a second year. That's what retention means. They could have started at North Dakota State and transferred to UCLA. They're still counted as retention. They could have started at Seward County and transferred to Johnson County. They're still counted, as long as they transferred in the system and they completed that year. That's this number. The second number I want you to look at is this maroon. 4.6% 2 years out have already graduated. They have an associate degree or they have a credential. All right? And our researchers we're calling it scrubbing. They're scrubbing this data. So we're showing you what the clearinghouse, I'm going to combine it, and you astute mathematicians are going to look at me as a social studies teacher and say these numbers aren't going to add up because they're a little higher. But when our researchers went in and looked at every one of these kids and tried to make sense of the certificates, here's what we found. 55% either still in the game or have graduated in this class only, second year out of school. I want to stop there. So they went to school, they either are still going or they have graduated. If that's true, then remedial education doesn't matter. Does that make sense? They've overcome that. So that's why we're not going to measure it. Then we hand it off to higher ed to finish. Because I got married. I'm laying drunk in Aggieville. I don't know, whatever the case is. I can't, or both. Yeah. Or I wish someone would have married me, and I wish I was drunk in Aggieville. Whatever. All right. So this is important because It tells us where we're at. Now, what's the number we need? 70 to 75. 70 to 75, what we need. Why? That shows you the likelihood they're entering the middle class, that kid is entering the middle class, and our economy has to have it. Now, there's something glaringly wrong with this number if that's all we use. Someone tell me what's glaringly wrong with that 55% if we only use that number. Doesn't include the kids that never made it through high school. So, here's the number. That's the percent of kids in 2010 in Kansas that graduated from high school. 81%. 19% of kids never made it to the stage in the class of 2010. So we have to take this number, this percent, times that percent to get the effective rate. Some of you just went, what? What? So I know some of you are smarter than Brad and I, and you're saying, hey, I know how to do this. I'll graduate every kid from high school, and that little number is going to go up. No, it won't, because your post-secondary will come down, and they're in a relationship with each other. Oh, Max says, I'll just kick out those stinking 7% of kids in Hillsboro that aren't doing very well, because all the rest of them will show me 100%, but your graduation rate will go down. You got to have both.
So very simply, that's the percent of the kids that graduated. That's the percent of that class 4 years earlier when they were freshmen. So if you think, and I did this with a group of parents, I had about 90 parents in there, and I said, act like you're all freshmen. How many of you think you're going to go to college and graduate? How many parents you think raise their hand?
All of them.
All of them. I said, well, in Kansas, if you were in 2010, 20% of you won't even graduate. So in that year, 55% of the graduates made it to that second year, but only 44% of the freshman class when they were freshmen.
And that's not completed. That's 2 years out. They're still in the game where they did complete. That's the number we're trying to get to 70 to 75, and K-Board's got to graduate. Or Bethel's got to graduate, or right? Or Creighton's got to graduate. So.
And you want the effective post-secondary rate to be the 70 to 75.
I do. Yep. Flip it over. That was the class of 2010. Now look at this. I'm giving you state averages. I've looked at your data a lot. I just want you to know. I've looked at your data maybe more than you've looked at your data. Now we're looking at the class of 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. And soon, I'm going to be showing you 15 because we're going to wait for this entire year to get over so we can populate it. So follow along. Remember that what we just looked at? 81% graduate from high school. That's the yellow. There's your yellow bar of high school graduation. 5-year average rates, 84% statewide. Now, Bill, this is important for smaller districts because if you take a 1-year snapshot, 1 or 2 kids start doing this to you, right? So it's important that we do a 5-year average. Bigger school districts, you start to get the size of Nickerson or Bueller or beyond. You get to Newton and Hutch. You don't see that quite as much, even though you'll see a little bit. But boy, in the smaller ones, it'll bounce on you. So we've got to look at a 5-year average. That's why this is so important. All right? So now we're looking at 5 years. The orange bar, that's your 2 years out, your 55%. Who's still in the game? Our 5-year average across Kansas, 55%. But what we're after is the blue bar, which is this times the graduation rate, which in Kansas is 46%.
For you mathematicians in here, you're already saying, well, you can't take a percent times a percent. That's like using an easy button to find an easy button.
Our researchers were flopping on
the
the floor like a fish.
It's like, no, it actually works out.
Yeah, and then they said, doggone it, it's pretty darn close. It's like within,
It's within a percent.
So us social studies people reunited right there. Yes, ma'am. plays into it huge. So if you heard me testify last Thursday, I will tell you that it's dismal with virtual kids. That's up to you. What do you mean, how do you mitigate it? You put them in, you took the money. I don't know. It's up to you guys to determine how you do it. I'm just saying it may not be the first thing you want to do when you look at an intervention.
What the data tells us,
you just said, yeah.
our virtual students, the percent of them that ever go on and make it to here, 6
to 7%. So if you're
So
running
we
a
may
large
have
virtual school, your data comes down.
Yeah.
Now, that's not true of programs within the school. If you're running just for your kids, we don't see that quite as much.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
All we're saying
It's
is,
something we have to look at.
all we're saying is you took the money, you said that's how we're going to educate them, so you got to live with the results of it. And that's different than whether they scored proficient on an exam. So this is new. This is a snapshot looking back. Good question. Good question. Yes, sir?
Just so I understand, is the orange bar is basically the percentage of our graduates that are
Yes.
successful. The blue bar is the percentage of all of our kids.
Yes.
This is percent of graduates. Yeah,
So-
percent of graduates. This is percent of the kids from the freshman cohort to the second year out of high school.
These two here have the same denominator. If there were 100 kids, 80 of them graduated. And 44 of those 100 made it. This is a percent of just the ones that graduated. Right?
Everyone
Same
yes.
denominator.
So that blue is who started as a freshman in high school. All right, not the ins and outs. Those don't count. That cohort, and then 2 years out of high school, how many of them have completed something or are still in the game?
And this, the main thing for this, it values two things. Getting them to the second year and increasing your graduation rate at the same time.
Got to do both.
It connects those two together. If we could get more kids to graduate, you know.
So when you look at your graduation rate, Ethan, if it's setting at 98%, you need to put your money into your post-secondary effective rate. If you're setting at 65%, you may want to start playing with your graduation rate at the same time. Does that make sense? Because you're not going to, one or two kids every year, you're going to go from 95 to 100. We have a lot of smaller districts have 100% graduation every year. But their post-secondary numbers aren't very good. And remember, we want to look at this over 5 years because the small districts are going to bounce all over the place. And so if you take the 5-year snapshot, drop off 1 year each year, you're going to get a much more balanced perspective of what happens to the smaller districts like Inman.
The only way to get these two to be equal, 100% graduation rate.
And
Some districts have
100%
that.
post-secondary effective rate. So 5-year average. Now, real quick, before we take a break, we get into the details of the KISA, how this all comes together. Shelley's going to say, rightfully so, Randy, if you're going to hold this accountable, Hutchinson will never do as well as Bueller because of the kids that we have. Right? And that's legitimate. I have more poverty. I have more kids in foster care. I have more mobility. And so as Brad talked about those comprehensive schools, here are some factors that we've looked at in all of your districts. Percent of kids on free lunch. That's correlated. We've looked at percent of special ed kids. We've looked at percent of ELL kids. We've looked at percent of kids in cumulative poverty. That is, over 5 years, have they stayed in poverty? Okay? We've looked at the percent of new teachers in your district because that heavy turnover plays a factor. And we've looked at, and I'm missing one, chronic absenteeism, missing more than 10 days. We've taken those 6 factors and we've layered that upon this data, and we haven't shared it at all. Except Brad and I, look at this, look at that. But I'm going to share a little bit today, just because it's not perfect yet, but we've shared it. Because the #1 state in the school of out-proceeding school district, their expectation, then we said, Shelley, here's what we would expect Hutchinson to do. Are you doing a better job or not as good a job based upon your risk factors? And the top school district over this 5-year period is seated here today. Want to guess? Want to take credit? Chase Raymond.
Really?
Yes. 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 Now, this is it. We're looking in the rearview mirror. What happens going forward? Okay. Are they the top performing school district in the state? No. But they're 3 standard deviations above what we would predict them to be. 3 standard deviations. Pretty good, huh? So we're just looking at that saying, how do we adjust for all the differences we have in Kansas so that you don't say, well, no doubt that Andover is going to do better than El Dorado, right? Because of the kids that they have. We're trying to adjust that, and we're just in the early processes of taking a look. But since you guys were here, we wanted to give you some kudos as we look at that going forward.
So it's possible a really high-performing school district may not actually meet the expectations when you layer that.
That's right.
I'm going to give you.
Oh, they don't.
Which will be a gut check.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
We have some districts
Yes.
looking at it
They will not like it when it comes
that
out.
have low poverty, low mobility, low whatever. So as compared to all buildings and districts like them, they may have pretty high numbers, but they're not getting near what they ought to
Right.
based on their
And-
clientele.
And Cindy, what we're currently looking at may change. We're looking at those above 1 standard deviation on either side. If you're below 1 standard deviation, it's, whoa, what's going on, right?
Yep.
And if you're above 1 standard deviation,
3
it-
standard deviations is impressive.
3.5.
3.5, like that's, like if you think of the gifted.
She's already tweeting.
A minute and way out.
All come to Chase Raymond. We all want to go to Chase. But you know what? We'd like to know what's going on there versus someone that's negative 3 standard deviations, especially if they were small schools. Here's what I told Brad looking over the weekend. Size has no matter. Small districts, large, medium are all in the top and all in the bottom. Here's what early on seems to matter if you're running large virtual schools. If you're running large virtual schools, you're underperforming. If you're running large, I'm talking about wholesale. Okay, if you're running, that's just at a quick glance, Shelley.
So this sounds like really interesting data, Randy. Are you going to be individually letting us see that for ourselves?
Yes.
And what's the time?
Come to the Council of Superintendents. We're going to give you your data.
All right.
Come to the curricular leaders. We're going to give you your data. We're going to walk through this with your data. All right, as we look at this. But we like this a lot because if we're asking the question, who in this blue has post-secondary success? What do you have to do back in Anthony or Harper? You got to increase academics. You got to increase employability, right? You got to increase all those things. You have to do a lot of things to get this number to move, not just one.
Back to the beginning. We're just giving you what your weight is, kind of standing on the scale. When you start looking at that, all right, what's it telling you? Look at the kids in the yellow. Why are they? You'll know them by name. Look at the kids in the purple that never showed up, all right? What do I need to start doing then with the rigor of our curriculum, our instructional practices, how we engage our parents, that's where you live. And we're just saying, pick a couple areas to get started.
And I'm going to say this because we need to research this deeply. And our research teams and REL and KSB are going to be looking at this in a lot of data. But casually, the non-researcher, Brad and I looking at this, we might say a virtual environment may not be your first intervention for kids not doing well. It may need to be targeted, but not universal, like it is in so much of Kansas. Let's go to credit recovery or put you in a virtual. It doesn't seem on a large scale to be very effective compared to some other. We need a lot more data on that. I'm just telling you, when we look at this data, Brad said, the big virtual schools tend not to do very well. Yes?
If I have color districts, what color did they use to click? And I noticed that they have to show up some
They'll be in the blue.
or that purple, that
Yeah,
top
that
color.
maroon.
So when you look at this, when you get this information, you'll know every one of those kids by name. And if they're in the purple, the very top color, and they went military, that's where they're going to be, but you'll know where they're at. So add them.
To the maroon. Through the accreditation process. Through the
That's what
accreditation.
we're looking at. How can we add more to this? We're going to try and get the military.
We're trying to get as pure as we can, but it's not ivory pure. But listen, this is the argument I had with my wife recently. I don't know if I like some of this. Da, da, da. I said, so you want to go back and measuring test scores? Oh, no, 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 no. Okay, so work with us on it's not ivory pure, and we're not trying to rank order. We're trying to give you data to make decisions about. It's not about who scored number one and who scored. We're just trying to say, look, and if we layer it on, then we can clearly go, and take a look at Inman and say, here's what we would predict Inman to be based upon those 6 risk factors, and here's where you actually scored over a 5-year average, which again kind of mitigate those.
And let me stress again that unlike No Child Left Behind and AYP, and even in our ESEA waiver, we will not be saying, oh, and you got to cut that in half or increase it in 6, it's this informs.
Do you have growth? And as Brad's going to talk about when we come back from break, do you have a process in place to get there? And guess who's going to help? Every service center is going to say to you, we're going to help you through this, do it legitimately. Okay?
Because we do have a district that has fairly, I don't know, low blue. I'd say 38%. But based on their risk factors, they're like 2 standard deviations above where they ought to be. I mean, they're just rocking it. But they have huge risk factors.
Okay, here's the data. 86% of Kansans will graduate high school. 56% will enroll 2 or 4 year. 46% will complete 1 year of college or graduated. And 6 years later, 32% have completed anything. That 14% drop, the colleges and universities and tech schools have to deal with. When we go public, they're going to have to deal with it.
You say, whoa, whoa, whoa. This says 39% complete something. 39% of the graduates. You take it back to that freshman cohort. So I visited with those parents. I said, statewide average, as freshmen, you all raised your hand. Out of 100 of you, only 32 of you will ever complete something. And those parents were like, what? That's just on if you're state average. Some of you are better than that. You walk it back to that freshman class, it's kind of hard to tell parents only 32 of you will ever complete something after high school.
And it'll be really cool to look at elementary and see how many leave elementary prepared, right? So if you have more than one elementary, if I were in McPherson, look at 4 elementary, I'd be breaking that down by elementary and seeing, okay, where do those kids come from that were successful and where were they not? Are there any patterns with that? Yes. 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 If they transfer to another accredited school.
So if I had 100
If they drop out, they
freshmen,
count.
then they
They're
become
in their cohort.
they become part of their cohort.
Yes.
Right.
So you get them as a junior, they're in your cohort.
So I may have started with 100 freshmen, but by the time they're seniors, if I had 7 move in, that cohort becomes 107. If 7 moved out, that cohort became 93.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about if they go to a non-accredited school, if they get homeschooled, they're counted as a dropout.
Or a non-graduate.
Yeah, once they start high school.
They're a non-graduate.